we'll uncover the shocking evidence that challenges everything we've been taught about ancient Egypt and reveal why this mystery could rewrite human history. Stick around, because what you're about to learn will change how you see the past forever. Let's start with the Great Sphinx. Most Egyptologists claim it was built around 2500 BCE, but there's a problem. The erosion patterns on its body don't match the dry climate of Egypt. Geologist Robert Schoch, after years of study, concluded that the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, suggesting it was exposed to heavy rainfall.
I am convinced that it is a ruin from pre-dynastic Egypt.
And here's the kicker. The last time Egypt experienced such rainfall was over 12,000 years ago, during the Younger Dryas period, a time when the Sahara was lush and green.
I must pay tribute to two individuals, actually three individuals in particular. One of them is John Anthony West. He was the first person in our era to begin to wonder if the Sphinx was much older than it had been. Actually, he got that idea from a philosopher called Schwaller de Lubicz, who'd noticed what he thought was water erosion on the body of the Sphinx. John West picked that up, and he was a great amateur Egyptologist himself. And when he looked at the Sphinx and at the strange scalloped erosion patterns and the vertical fissures, particularly in the trench around the Sphinx, he began to think maybe Schwaller was right. Maybe there was some sort of flooding here. And that's when he brought Robert Schoch, geologist at Boston University. He brought Schoch to Giza and say, well, it looks to me like the Sphinx was exposed to at least 1,000 years of heavy rainfall.
We have incredible amount of weathering and erosion on the Sphinx. I now think that it goes back to the end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 BC.
And as Schoch's calculations have continued, as he's continued to be immersed in this mystery, he's continuously pushed that back. And he's now, again, looking at the date of around 12,500 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, for the creation of the Great Sphinx. And then, of course, this is the period of the wet Sahara, the humid Sahara. The Sahara was a completely different place during the Ice Age. There were rivers in it, there were lakes in it, it was fertile, it was possibly densely populated, and there was a lot of rain. There's not no rain in Giza today, but there's relatively little rain.
Now, let's talk about the pyramids. The three Great Pyramids of Giza are perfectly aligned with the stars of Orion's Belt, a constellation the ancient Egyptians associated with Osiris, their god of the afterlife. But here's the twist. The alignment isn't perfect for 2500 BCE. Rewind the stars using astronomical precession, and you'll find they match perfectly around 10,500 BCE, the same time the Sphinx likely existed. Coincidence? Or evidence of a much older civilization?
The next person who needs to be mentioned in this context is Robert Bauval. Robert is the genius, and it does take a genius sometime to make these connections, because nobody'd noticed it before, that the three pyramids of Giza are laid out on the ground in the pattern of the three stars of Orion's Belt. And skeptics will say, well, you can find any buildings and line them up with any stars you want, but Orion actually isn't any old constellation. Orion was the god Osiris in the sky. He was, the ancient Egyptians called the Orion constellation Sahu, and they recognize it as the celestial image of the god Osiris. So what's being copied on the ground is the belt of a deity, of a celestial deity. It's not just a random constellation. And then when we take precession into account, you find something else very intriguing happening. First of all, you find that the exact orientation of the pyramids as it is today, and pretty much as it was when they're supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago, it's not precisely related to how Orion's Belt looked at that time. There's a bit of a twist. They're not quite right. But as you precess the stars backwards, as you go back and back and back, and you come to around 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, in the Younger Dryas, you find that suddenly they lock perfectly. They match perfectly with the three pyramids on the ground. And that's the same moment that the Great Sphinx, an equinoctial monument, aligned perfectly to the rising sun on the spring equinox. Anybody can test this for themselves. Just go to Giza on the 21st of March, be there before dawn, stand behind the Sphinx, and you will see the sun rising directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx.
And then there's the Sphinx's head. Many researchers, including Graham Hancock, believe it was originally a lion, a symbol of the constellation Leo. Around 10,500 BCE, Leo would have risen directly behind the Sphinx during the spring equinox. But by 2500 BCE, the age of Taurus, a lion wouldn't make sense. This suggests the Sphinx was recarved into a pharaoh's head thousands of years later, preserving an ancient astronomical message.
But the question is, what constellation was behind the Sphinx? And 12,500 years ago, it was the constellation of Leo. And actually, the constellation of Leo has a very Sphinx-like look. And I and my colleagues are pretty sure that the Sphinx was originally a lion entirely. Over the thousands of years, it became damaged, it became eroded, particularly the part of it that sticks out the head. By the time you come to the Fourth Dynasty, when the Great Pyramids are supposedly built, by the time you come to the Fourth Dynasty, the head of the lion, original lion head, would have been a complete mess. And we suggest that it was then recarved into a pharaonic head. Egyptologists think it was the pharaoh Khafre, but there's no real strong resemblance. But it's definitely wearing the Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. And we think that that's a result of a recarving of what was originally not only a lion-bodied, but also a lion-headed monument. It wouldn't make sense if you create an equinoctial marker in the time of Khafre, 4,500 years ago, and the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. I mean, it's 270 feet long and 70 feet high, and it's looking directly at the rising sun on the equinox. If you create it then, you'd be more likely to create it in the shape of a bull, because that was the age of Taurus, when the constellation of Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox. So why is it a lion? And again, we think that's because of that observation of the skies and putting on the ground, as above, so below, putting on the ground an image of the sky at a particular time. Now, the fact that the Giza Plateau, that the principal monuments of the Giza Plateau, the three Great Pyramids and the Great Sphinx, all lock astronomically on the date of around 10,500 BC, to me is most unlikely to be an accident. And actually, if you look at computer software at the sky at that time, you'll see that the Milky Way is very prominent and seems to be mirrored on the ground by the River Nile. I suggest that may be one of the reasons amongst many why Giza was chosen as the site for this very special place.
But the evidence doesn't stop there. The megalithic temples near the Sphinx, built with blocks weighing up to 100 tons, show erosion patterns that match the Sphinx. Even more intriguing, the granite blocks added later were cut to fit these erosion marks, proving the temples existed long before the dynastic Egyptians. So, who built them and why?
The point I want to make is an astronomical design on the ground which memorializes a very ancient date does not have to have been done 12,500 years ago. If from the ancient Egyptian point of view, you're there 4,500 years ago, and there's a time 8,000 years before that, which is very, very, very important to you, you could use astronomical language and megalithic architecture to memorialize that date on the Giza Plateau, which is what we think we're looking at, except for one thing, and that's the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. And we're pretty sure that the Sphinx, at least, does date back to 12,500 years ago. The megalithic temples, the so-called Valley Temple, which stands just to the east and just to the south of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx Temple, which stands directly in front of the Sphinx. The Sphinx Temple has largely been destroyed, but the Valley Temple, attributed to Khafre on no good grounds whatsoever, is a huge megalithic construction with blocks of limestone that weigh up to 100 tons each. And yet it has been remodeled, refaced with granite. There are granite blocks that are placed on top of the core limestone blocks. And those core limestone blocks were already eroded when the granite blocks were put there. Why? Because the granite blocks have actually been purposefully and deliberately cut to fit into the erosion marks.
Now, let's dive into the Great Pyramid. This 6 million ton marvel is aligned to true north with astonishing precision, within 1/60th of a degree. Its internal chambers, including the King's Chamber and the mysterious subterranean chamber, suggest it was more than just a tomb. The absence of hieroglyphs inside, unlike later pyramids, hints at a different purpose. And the graffiti attributing the pyramid to Pharaoh Khufu? Some experts believe it might have been forged. So, who really built it?
The Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill, and that natural hill might have been seen as the original primeval mound to the ancient Egyptians. The three Great Pyramids of Giza are different from later pyramids. Is the story of pyramid building? When did it really begin? And the timeline that we get from Egyptology is the first pyramid is the pyramid of the pharaoh Zoser, about 100 years or so before the Giza pyramids are built. And then we have this explosion in the Fourth Dynasty, dynasty of true pyramids. We have 3 of them attributed to a single pharaoh, Sneferu, who built supposedly the pyramid at Maidum and the 2 pyramids at Dashur, the bent and the red pyramid. And then within that same 100-year span, we have the Giza pyramids being built. This is according to the Orthodox chronology. And then suddenly, once the Giza project is finished, pyramid building goes into a massive slump in ancient Egypt. But what happens when you go inside them is you find that they're extensively covered in hieroglyphs and imagery, repeating the name of the king who was supposedly buried in that place. Whereas the Giza pyramids have no internal inscriptions whatsoever. What we do have is one piece of graffiti. There was an Arab caliph, Caliph al-Mamun, who had already realized that other pyramids did have their entrances in the north face. Nobody knew where the entrance to the Great Pyramid was. But he figured there's an entrance to this thing. It's going to be in the north face somewhere. So he put together a team of workers, and they went in with sledgehammers and they started smashing where he thought would be the entrance. And they cut their way into the Great Pyramid for a distance of maybe 100 feet. And then the hammering that they did dislodged something. They heard a little bit further away something big falling, and they realized there was a cavity there, and they started heading in that direction. And then they joined the internal passageway of the Great Pyramid, the descending and the ascending corridors that go up. When you go up the ascending corridor, every one of the internal passageways in the Great Pyramid that people can walk in slopes at an angle of 26 degrees. That's interesting because the angle of slope of the exterior of the Great Pyramid is 52 degrees. So we know mathematicians were at work as well as geometers in the creation of the Great Pyramid. If you go up the Grand Gallery, which is at the end of the so-called ascending corridor, and it's above the so-called Queen's Chamber. You go up the Grand Gallery, you're eventually going to come to what is known as the King's Chamber, in which there is a sarcophagus. And that sarcophagus is a little bit too big to have been got in through the narrow entrance passageway. It's almost as though the so-called King's Chamber was built around the sarcophagus already in place. Above the King's Chamber are 5 other chambers. These are known as relieving chambers. The theory was that they were built to relieve the pressure on the King's Chamber of the weight of the monument. But I think what makes that theory dubious is the fact that even lower down, where more weight was involved, you have the Queen's Chamber, and there are no such relieving chambers above that. In the top of these 5 chambers, a British adventurer and vandal called Howard Vyse, who dynamited his way into those chambers in the first place, allegedly found, well, he claims he found the graffiti, a piece of graffiti left by a work gang naming the pharaoh Khufu. And it's true, I've been in that chamber, and there is the cartouche of Khufu there, quite recognizable. But the dispute around it is whether that is a genuine piece of graffiti dating from the Old Kingdom, or whether Howard Vyse actually put it there himself.
In a world where we often think we have uncovered all the secrets of the past, a conversation between Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock on the Joe Rogan podcast reveals a fascinating story of ancient seafaring cultures. While archaeology acknowledges the Polynesian expansion as the first great seafaring adventure, Hancock questions the evidence and points to DNA evidence from the Amazon and ancient maps as proof of a global navigating culture in the Ice Age. The discovery of an old map that shows the world as it looked during the last Ice Age, incorporating precise relative latitudes and longitudes, is hard to explain. What could this mean? Was there an advanced civilization that existed long before ours that had mastered the art of ocean navigation?
When archaeologists talk about seafaring humans, what do they date that to?
The great seafaring adventure that is accepted by archaeology is called the Polynesian expansion. And it's a remarkable story. And that occurs roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. And those Polynesians were amazing ocean navigators. They could cross distances of thousands of kilometers with pinpoint accuracy. I mean, it's not an accident that the Polynesians found Easter Island. Finding Easter Island is a really challenging project. Easter Island is 2,000 miles from the coast of South America. It's 2,000 miles from the nearest other island, which is Tahiti. It's just a little speck in the middle of the ocean, but the Polynesians found it and settled there and appear to have brought a reproductively viable population there and appear to have made voyages back and forth. But that was 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. That was not 12,800 years ago. And this is where archaeology's adamant position that ocean voyaging was begun by the Polynesians and that there was no major ocean voyages before that, I think needs to be strongly questioned, and it needs to be strongly questioned in the light of this DNA evidence from the Amazon rather than rejecting the evidence. An attempt should be made to consider what that might mean.
Well, it's interesting because we know that the Egyptians had boats.
Yeah.
And so, if there were boats 4,500 years ago, why do we think that they didn't try them out in the ocean? That doesn't make any sense, especially if they existed 1,000 years prior, which is also possible.
Archaeologists wouldn't argue that the Egyptians had boats, but that is still within the framework of accepted history. It's the notion of a global navigating culture in the Ice Age that archaeologists can't swallow. It's a subject that I've kept on coming up against over a number of years. I think the best evidence for it is ancient maps, which show the world as it looked during the last ice age. We're talking about maps that were drawn roughly between the 1300s and the 1700s. In other words, in relatively recent history. However, these maps were largely based on much older source maps, which they copied. And we can say that for sure, because one of the famous maps is the Piri Reis map, which was created by a Turkish admiral called Piri Reis in the year 1513. Actually, only a corner of his map has survived. It was originally a world map. We now just have a bit that shows the east coast of South America and North America and the west coast of Africa. Piri Reis writes in that map that it is in his own handwriting that he based it on more than 100 older source maps, some of which had come from the Library of Alexandria. In other words, that maps had been, when the Library of Alexandria had been destroyed in the 4th century AD or whenever it was, some of its contents had been rescued and brought to Constantinople, which became the Turkish capital. And Piri Reis had access to those maps, and he incorporated information from those maps on his maps, as well as incorporating more recent navigational information. And this is one of a whole category of maps which are extremely hard to explain. All of them based on older source maps, now lost, all of them incorporating extremely precise relative longitudes and latitudes. Latitude is not that difficult a technological feat, but longitude is a difficult technological feat. Longitude involves a chronometer. It involves knowing the time at the place you began your voyage and the local noon as well, and calculating the difference between them. You need a chronometer that will keep accurate time at sea with the motions of a ship. And it's just a plain fact that our civilization did not invent such a chronometer until the late 18th century. Before that, we didn't know what longitude we were at, and ships were constantly sailing unexpectedly into coastlines that they thought were hundreds of miles further away. So the discovery of the technique to do longitude was a major civilizational advance. Its presence in maps based on much older source maps that actually show the world as it looks during the last ice age suggests that somebody during the last ice age was mapping the world and had mastered the technique of calculating longitude. Classic example of these maps, and I make a point of this, is what's called the Pinkerton World Map, which was drawn in the year 1818, and it was based on the latest navigational information at that time. I reproduced that map in the book. What's missing from the map, entirely missing, is Antarctica. There's just a hole at the bottom of the world. There's nothing there. The reason that Antarctica is not there is that our civilization hadn't discovered Antarctica in 1818. So they couldn't authentically put it on a map in 1818. Actually, we discovered it in 1819, and that's when it starts appearing on modern maps. The problem is that Antarctica appears repeatedly on these much older maps, and it appears in the right place and a bit bigger than it is today, but very much as it looked during the last ice age. So what all of this suggests to me is that the world was mapped and explored by a global seafaring culture with a level of technology that was at least equivalent to ours at the end of the 18th century during the ice age.
Wasn't there also a map of Greenland that showed it underneath the ice?
Yes, there are. And another intriguing thing, I mentioned the Piri Reis map just now. Shown on the Piri Reis map, lying off the east coast of North America, is a large island with a row of megaliths, like a road of megaliths, running up the middle of it. That island is in the exact place of the Grand Bahama Banks. So this island is sitting there off the southeast coast of North America.
Look at the way they used to draw things back then, too.
And what you see running down the middle of it is this road-like feature of megaliths. I'll point them out again.
I see, right there, yeah.
These here. Now, the thing is, there was a long period of my life when I did a lot of scuba diving, and I was looking at underwater structures. And one of the sites I dived on was the Bimini Road, which is in the Grand Bahama Banks. And the Bimini Road is exactly where that island is. And here's the issue. I don't care whether the Bimini Road is natural or man-made. For me, the mystery is that it is shown above water on that map. And the last time it was above water was thousands and thousands of years ago. So for me, this is all evidence that we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that our ancestors had achieved a level of technology where they could explore and map the world's oceans. We shouldn't dismiss that. And the whole effort of archaeology has been to dismiss the significance of the Bimini Road.
How would they dismiss that?
Well, they say
they
say it's totally natural. I can tell you, I absolutely do not think it's natural. I think it's a man-made structure, but the argument is that it's a kind of beach rock that forms in these blocky formations.
Does it? Is that
yes,
right?
beach rock does form in blocky formations, but here I believe that the beach rock has been used as a construction material. But I repeat, the key issue is not whether the Bimini Road is man-made or not. The key issue is that it features on a map above water. And that is a dating project. That tells us that somebody was mapping that bit of the world when it was above water. And
Jamie,
that
go back to that last
takes us back a long way into the past.
They say that there was a huge land in the Pacific, far, far away, and that it was destroyed in a flood cataclysm, and that there were survivors, specifically 7 wise men. That's another thing that is found all around the world. Specific 7 wise men who came after this great cataclysm.
Have you ever wondered where the first spark of civilization truly came from? What if I told you that long before Egypt raised its pyramids and long before Sumer etched the first cuneiform, there was another world? A world that vanished almost entirely, leaving behind only fragments, myths, and whispers. Across ancient cultures, from the temples of India to the pyramids of Mexico, stories emerge of 7 wise men. Mysterious figures who brought knowledge, order, and civilization after a great catastrophe. Who were they? And more importantly, what were they trying to preserve? This is not mythology. This is the hidden history of humanity.
They also refer to these individuals as being bearded. They often refer to there being 7 of them. In ancient Mesopotamia, they're called the 7 sages. In ancient Egypt, at the Temple of Horus at Edfu, they are also referred to as the 7 sages. In ancient India, it's Manu and the 7 sages who appear after the flood, trying to restore the knowledge that was lost during the time of the flood.
The number 7 is deeply embedded in mythologies around the world, and not by coincidence. In ancient India, the Saptarishi, 7 sages, are said to have received divine wisdom to guide mankind. In Mesopotamia, they appear as the Apkallu, fish-cloaked beings sent by the god Enki to civilize humanity after a flood. In Greece, echoes of this can be found in the 7 sages of antiquity. And in the Andes, Viracocha is said to have arrived with bearded companions to restore civilization. Even in the Pacific, Polynesian navigators speak of ancestral wise figures who came from the sea, teaching astronomy and the stars. These are not isolated stories. They're part of a pattern, a memory, of survivors from a lost world. Roughly 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something catastrophic occurred. The Younger Dryas, a sudden global freeze, brought chaos. Megafauna died out. Sea levels rose dramatically.
The Younger Dryas really ticks all the boxes as a worldwide disaster, which definitely involved sea level rise, both at the beginning and at the end of the Younger Dryas. It definitely involved the swallowing up of lands that previously had been above water. And I think it's an excellent candidate for this worldwide tradition of a global cataclysm, of which one of, but not the only, distinguishing characteristics was a flood, an enormous flood, and the submergence of lands that had previously been above water, underwater. The fact that this story is found all around the world suggests to me, we know there was a nasty epoch, the Younger Dryas, when flooding did occur and when the Earth was subjected to events cataclysmic enough to extinguish entirely the megafauna of the Ice Age.
Hancock argues that this was the moment a global civilization was erased, not Atlantis in the mythic sense, but an advanced seafaring culture, capable of building, mapping, and teaching. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, over 11,600 years old, are proof that someone was building monumental architecture right after this catastrophe. But who? And why did they bury it? The 7 wise men were not gods. They were messengers, survivors, custodians of memory. In myths, they bring writing, agriculture, astronomy, laws, sacred geometry, the foundations of civilization.
They were the same teachers, the teachers that went to all the ancient cultures and brought them the basics for what we've accomplished today.
In India, the Saptarishi taught Vedic rituals and the cosmic order. The Apkallu instructed the Sumerians on canal systems and calendars. In Mexico, Quetzalcoatl brings maize and the calendar to the Toltecs. Everywhere, the same pattern. A civilizing force that appears suddenly, then disappears. Why do ancient megaliths around the world share impossible similarities? Cyclopean stone blocks at Sacsayhuaman, Peru, cut with laser-like precision.
One of the most beautiful ancient structures you will ever see in your life. There are massive, gigantic megalithic blocks, and you find the most amazing of masonry style where you can't even fit a dollar bill in between the fittings of any of the blocks.
Underwater ruins off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan. Alignment of pyramids to Orion's belt in Egypt and Teotihuacan. How could isolated ancient cultures achieve such feats unless they inherited something? Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang, Nan Madol. Each site predates the societies that supposedly built them. Each one speaks of a forgotten past. Academic orthodoxy resists these ideas. Why? Because they rewrite everything. They challenge the linear model, that human history moved slowly from stone tools to civilization in a neat progression. But when archaeologists found 9,000-year-old earthworks in the Amazon, when LIDAR revealed vast city networks hidden beneath jungles, the official story began to crack.
These things shouldn't exist.
What if everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations was wrong? What if, deep in the Amazon rainforest, a place long considered untouched, wild, and uncivilized, lies a forgotten world built by hands that mastered geometry, astronomy, and perhaps even the secrets of the mind? Why are massive geometric structures appearing beneath the trees? Who made them? And why does mainstream archaeology refuse to investigate them further?
What I see in the Amazon is traces of a lost science, a scientific mindset.
This isn't fantasy. This is the Amazon. And these are the questions Graham Hancock dares to ask. The Amazon basin stretches across 6.7 million square kilometers. It's one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. But beneath its dense canopy, recent discoveries are shaking the foundation of our historical understanding. In the state of Acre, southwestern Brazil, deforestation revealed something completely unexpected. Shapes, circles, squares, rectangles, and octagons etched into the earth, often spanning hundreds of meters. These aren't modern constructions. They are ancient, possibly thousands of years old, and they're not random. They're precise, the kind of precision you'd expect from engineers, not hunter-gatherers. These are known as geoglyphs, massive geometrical earthworks, but they're not isolated. Researchers have found over 450 of them in this region alone, and that's just what we've uncovered so far. Most of the Amazon remains unscanned, unexplored, and untouched.
These things really, on the old view of the Amazon, shouldn't exist. They involve enormous expenditure of effort. Creating these earthworks is a huge job.
How were these massive shapes created in such a challenging environment? Who coordinated the labor? Who designed the layout? Mainstream archaeology still clings to an outdated belief that the Amazon was too harsh for large civilizations, that it was only ever home to scattered, simple tribes. But what if that's completely wrong?
I think the story's going to go back further and further into the past.
Graham Hancock, author of Fingerprints of the Gods, believes we're looking at evidence of a lost civilization, a culture with a scientific mindset, an understanding of geometry, and a spiritual connection to nature. Take the site of Fazenda Sipo, for instance. An octagon with rounded corners, and near it a massive oval surrounding a square. This isn't accidental. This is intentional design, almost architectural in nature. Then there's Jako Sa, where a perfect square surrounds a circle, resembling the ancient concept of squaring the circle, a philosophical and mathematical pursuit seen in ancient Greece and even in the construction of sacred spaces in Egypt and India. But these shapes aren't just geometrical, they may be astronomical. Two of the largest sites, Fazenda Paraná and Severino Calazans, are aligned to true astronomical north, not magnetic north. That requires a deep understanding of the stars. The site at Severino Calazans, for example, has a footprint nearly identical to that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, not in material, but in scale.
I'm drawing attention here to Severino Calazans, this large square on the left there, which has coincidentally the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It just shows you the size of that enormous earthwork.
And like the pyramid, it may have served a purpose beyond the physical, perhaps spiritual, ceremonial, or cosmological. But if these aren't temples or homes, what were they? According to indigenous oral traditions, these geoglyphs were used for shamanic ceremonies.
They say that they were for shamanic journeying, that the population would gather within them, that there would be certain areas that might be reserved for the shamans. For example, the square on the left, those two cut out areas, top left and right of that square, it suggested that shamans were in there and the rest of the population were in the other area, and they were undertaking visionary journeys, perhaps using ayahuasca. Of course, the Amazonian peoples are experts in the properties of indigenous plants.
Large gatherings where people consumed ayahuasca, a powerful psychedelic brew, to enter altered states of consciousness. Elders from the Ashaninka and other tribes speak of these places with reverence. They say the people would gather in these giant enclosures. The shamans would occupy special sections, perhaps the cutouts or central zones, and guide the community through visions. The geometric shapes seen during ayahuasca ceremonies, spirals, fractals, repeating symmetrical patterns, closely resemble the layout of these ancient earthworks. Coincidence? Or intentional design? In altered states, the mind perceives beyond the material. Geometry becomes alive. Patterns become gateways. And in the Amazon, these patterns may have been encoded into the land itself. This is not just speculation.
They also show the kind of entities that are seen in ayahuasca visions. They show the same sort of patterns, the same geometric patterns that are seen in ayahuasca. It literally an 8-kilometer Sistine Chapel in the Colombian Amazon. That's the other thing. I mentioned there's not a lot of rock in the Amazon. Where there is rock, they used it. There's rock paintings all over the Amazon where rock is available.
In the Colombian Amazon, in a remote area called Serranía de la Lindosa, researchers uncovered something even more shocking. An 8-kilometer-long rock wall, covered in paintings over 12,000 years old. These aren't just animals. They depict extinct megafauna, giant sloths, mastodons, Ice Age species. And more curiously, they show abstract shapes and humanoid forms that bear a striking resemblance to the entities and patterns people report seeing during ayahuasca journeys. Did ancient Amazonian peoples explore consciousness through plant medicine and document their experiences in both art and landscape? And if so, what knowledge were they trying to pass on? At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, dated to 11,600 years ago, megalithic stone circles show signs of astronomical alignment and sophisticated carvings. In Chauvet Cave, France, 36,000-year-old paintings include possible constellations. Even the famous Lascaux caves depict bulls with 6 dots above their shoulders, which some researchers believe represent the Pleiades star cluster in Taurus. Mainstream archaeologists reject these ideas. They insist that astronomy was discovered by the Greeks or Mesopotamians just a few thousand years ago.
The discovery of the constellations of the zodiac is given to the Greeks or perhaps to the Mesopotamians before the Greeks. It's not thought that any human culture could have noticed the constellations of the zodiac before that, and that's really absurd because the constellations of the zodiac are on the path of the sun. The sun rises against the background of a different constellation every month. And how would the ancients have missed that, especially since the skies were an ever-present phenomenon to them in a way that they are not to us.
Right.
We're cut off from the skies by light pollution, but the ancients were not.
But how could the ancients have missed it? The sun rises in a different constellation every month. The night sky is a giant celestial clock. To ancient people, without modern light pollution, the stars were like scripture. Graham Hancock argues that this global ancient awareness points to a pre-cataclysmic civilization, one wiped out perhaps during the Younger Dryas period, around 12,800 years ago, by a global disaster. The survivors? They may have passed on fragments of their knowledge, through myth, through ritual, through geometry in the jungle. And now, thanks to LiDAR, a technology that scans beneath forest canopy using lasers, we're finally seeing what's been hidden for millennia. The question is, are we ready to accept it? Why does mainstream academia resist these ideas? Why is there such pushback against the possibility that ancient civilizations were far more advanced than we ever imagined? Is it because the implications are too big? Because it would mean rewriting history, rethinking progress, reconsidering who we are and where we come from? Perhaps the Amazon still holds the answers, but only if we're willing to look, only if we're willing to listen to the voices of those who came before, not with steel and concrete, but with spirit, vision, and sacred geometry carved into the living earth. What else lies beneath the green ocean of trees? What have we forgotten? And what are we finally beginning to remember?